Namaskar and welcome back viewers. I am Surbhi Unyal and I teach philosophy at Hansraj College. We are doing a special lecture series on the special segment which is the symbolic expressions. And in this lecture series, we will be discussing yoga philosophy. In our previous lecture, we discussed the essence and the definition of the term yoga, specifically from Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. We will continue our discussion in this lecture where we will talk about chitta, chitta vrittis and different types of kleshas. So Patanjali's yoga, as I had already mentioned in my previous lecture, is defined as the cessation or the modification of the chittas, which is also known as chitta vritti nirodh. Now what is this chit? Chitta means three internal organs as described in Sankhya philosophy, which includes buddhi or the intellect, ahankar or ego, and the manas or the mind. Now this chitta is considered to be the first evolute of Prakriti, and it has the predominance of sattva. Its nature is that it is unconscious, but since it is finest and nearest to Purush, it has this power to reflect the Purush and therefore appears as if it is conscious. Now, when it gets related to any object, it assumes the form of that object, and this form is called as the vritti or modification. The light of consciousness which comes from the Purush, it illuminates that form, and that is known as Gyan. We also discussed that Purush is essentially pure consciousness. It is free from the limitations of Prakriti, but it wrongly identifies itself with the reflections in the chitta and appears to be undergoing a change or a modification. So this form is called vritti or modification. Due to the modifications of the chitta, the self knows the worldly objects. There is no real or actual modification that occurred in the self, but due to the reflection of Purush in the modification of chitta, there is an appearance of change or modifications that is found in it. Now the chitta gets modified or changed and acquires consciousness due to the reflection of the Purush on the self. But the real nature of Chit is material. The changes in Chit are known as these modifications or the vrittis. And these modifications are of 5 types. So you can say that there are 5 types of Chitta vrittis. The first is Praman, which is the right cognition. The second is Viparya, which is the wrong cognition. Third is Vikalp, which is verbal cognition or imagination. Fourth is Nidra, which is absence of cognition or sleep. The fifth is Smriti, which is memory. Now Praman, as again discussed earlier, that yoga school, just like Sankhya, it accepts 3 pramans, which is the perception, inference and shabd, which is verbal testimony. What happens in perception is that the chitta, through the sense organs, it could be both external or internal, it comes into the contact with the external objects of the world and assumes the form of that object. So when we perceive something, perception could take place through the external organs that we have, external sense organs, or the internal organ, the mind you can say. This comes into contact with the external object. So, these sense organs, they come into the contact with the external objects which are present in the world, and in that it assumes its form. So, it assumes the form of those objects. That is the process through perception. In the case of inference, the chitta, it cognizes the generic nature of objects, fine, because it tries to see these similarities, or it tries to see what are the generic nature of those objects, which is equally applicable to verbal testimony also. Now, the second type of chitta vritti is viparya. Viparya is positively wrong knowledge, like that of rope and snake. So, the expression viparya is understood as doubt. That means to possess not determinate knowledge of an object, which is known as doubt. For example, seeing an object and not able to cognize whether it is a shell or a silver. So, this results in doubt. The third is vikalp. Vikalp is mere verbal cognition, like that of hare's horn. It is the knowledge in which the object is known, but the object does not exist. So, the object does not really exist in the world, but still we have the knowledge of that object. Thus, it is treated as merely a verbal cognition, because through words you know an object, though that object does not really exist in the world. And the example given here is that of hare's horn, which does not really exist. But we are able to understand this, we are able to have a knowledge of that object. Then comes nidra. Nidra is called absence of cognition. Yet it is a mental modification, because after sleep a person says that I slept sound and knew nothing, and therefore there must be some mental modifications to support this absence of knowledge. So, what is happening here is that it is a knowledge of the absence of objects. So, in this stage, the chitta is predominated by tamas. However, this stage won't ignore the mild presence of knowledge while is in sleep. This is because after waking up from sleep, the person has consciousness that he or she had slept well and knew nothing. Thus, some sort of modifications are occurred even in sleep. Then comes smriti. Smriti is the recollection of past experience through the impressions left behind. Memory or smriti is a recollection of the past experiences, and this recollection is possible through our impressions that we left on the objects while cognized. Thus, in this stage, some sort of modifications are found in the chit. Now, having talked about various types of chitta vrittis, Now let us move on to kleshas. The Purush is the eternally pure and transcendental consciousness. It is the Chit with the reflection of the Purush in it, or you can say it is the Purush as reflected in the Chit, is the phenomenal ego or Jeev, which is subject to birth and death and transmigration and to all pain or pleasurable experiences, and which imagines itself as the agent and the enjoyer. Now there are 5 kinds of sufferings or the kleshas to which it is subjected or it is subject to. And yoga philosophy mentions that there are these 5 kinds of kleshas or sufferings. The first one is avidya or ignorance. The second is asmita or egoism. Third is rag, which is attachment. Fourth is dvesh or aversion. And the fifth is abhinivesh or clinging to life and fear of death. In this, avidya arises when we cognizing the self as non-eternal and material. But the real nature of self is bliss, eternal, and possesses pure consciousness. Asmita is wrongly identifying Purush and Prakriti and further bringing them in an equal platform. But in reality, Purush and Prakriti are 2 distinct entities, thus can't be equated with each other. Rag is the craving to get worldly pleasure like power, money, etc. Dvesh is anger in the means of suffering. The last is abhinivesh, which is the fear of death, which finds among all living beings. Fine, so these are various types of sufferings that has been talked in yoga philosophy. Then it also talks about different levels of mental life. So mental life, or you can say Chitta Bhumi, has 5 levels. The differences in the levels of these Chitta Bhumi or mental life is due to the predominance of different gunas. The first is Shipt or the restlessness, which is the lowest level, and because here the mind is restless due to the excess of rajas and is tossed about like a shuttlecock between different sense objects. Fine, so this is a state of restlessness. Since rajas is dominant in this stage of mind, it makes the mind restless. This is the first stage of Chit. In this stage, Chit is disturbed and attached to the worldly object. Fine, for example, Chit of those intoxicated by the possession of power and money, they are so restless because there is this disturbance which is caused by the predominance of rajas in this situation. The second is Mudha or the torpid. The second is called Mudha or the torpid, and the mind here has the predominance of tamas and tends towards ignorance, sleep and lethargy. Since tamas here is predominant and the qualities of tamas are to make someone lethargic. So here, because of the predominance of tamas, the mind tends towards ignorance, sleep and lethargy. Fine. The third is vikshipt, which is distracted. Here sattva dominates, but rajas also assert itself at times. So sattva is predominant, but there is a presence of rajas also in this stage. So in this stage, yoga begins and chitta tries to attain the God, or you can say the supreme soul. Due to the sattva dominance, it is found that there is temporary ceasing of the modifications of the chitta. Fine. So it is in this stage which is, that the sattva is dominating, but there is also rajas. But we can say that from this stage the yoga actually starts happening, or it begins. And chitta, it tries to attain the supreme soul. In fact, we can also say that this stage is a temporary stage of where the modification, it seems to cease for some time. The fourth and very important is ekagra, which is concentrated. The fourth, and this is the fourth type of the stage of mind. Here the mind is entirely dominated by sattva, and rajas and tamas are subdued. So here even rajas is not present. Fine. In the previous one, along with sattva, there was also sometimes rajas was also present. But in this stage, which is the ekagra or the concentrated stage, it is entirely dominated by sattva. And in this stage, rajas and tamas are subdued. So the mind becomes concentrated on the object of meditation. So it is due to the sattva that it is able to concentrate on the objects of meditation, where there is no disturbance due to rajas or tamas. The fifth is niruddha or restricted. This is known as the highest level. Here the mental modifications are arrested, though their latent impressions remain. So if you look at these 5 stages of mind, the first 3 levels are not at all conducive to the yogic life. Only the last 2 can be seen to be conducive to yogic life, which includes ekagra and niruddha. Because it is in this stage that mind has now started concentrating on the object, or the meditation, the higher level of meditation starts because of the predominance of sattva in these 2 stages. In the previous stage, which is a third one, there is, you can say, a starting point, but again we cannot surely say that this is the stage of the yogic life, which in fact happens when there is ekagra or concentration, because in the previous one there is some kind of distraction still present, while in ekagra we are totally or entirely concentrated on the object in the meditative level. While in the fifth one, we can say that there is ultimate removal of modifications, or you can say that's why it's called niruddha or restricted. And it is the highest level, and the mental modifications are arrested, though some might remain, but as impressions. Otherwise, this is the highest stage of the higher mental state, you can say. Now, I will very briefly touch upon the eightfold yoga, which is the Ashtanga Yoga, but we will discuss this topic elaborately in our next lecture, where we will talk about what this Ashtanga or eightfold yoga that has been described by Patanjali and its various aspects in detail. But let us look at it very briefly in today's lecture. That yoga, it advocates control over the body, the senses and the mind. Fine, so there is, in a way, you can say a unity, or you can say a control that has to take place between the mind, the senses and the body. It does not want to kill the body. On the other hand, it recommends its perfection. So a sound mind need a sound body. So if this is a very famous saying that in order to be a philosopher, you have to be, you also have to be a good body. So only when you will have a good body or a sound body, that's when you will be able to have sound mind as well. And it is through the practice of yoga that we can aim for the betterment of both mind and the body. Now the sensual attachment and passions distract body as well as the mind, and they must be conquered. How they will be conquered? To overcome them or to conquer them, yoga gives us the eightfold path of discipline, okay, or you can say the Ashtanga Yoga. So, for both the betterment of mind as well as the body, we need that these distractions that are taking place, these modifications that are taking place, we need to stop them, we need to overcome them, or we need to conquer them. How we will do that? We will be able to do that by disciplining. So we have to discipline ourselves, we have to discipline our body as well as our mind. That we are going to do with the help of Ashtanga Yoga, and since Asht comes from the word eight, so it is eightfold path. So what is these the prescribed 8 sadhanas to control the chitta, or you can say the in the Ashtanga Yoga, those eightfold paths are: the first is yam, second is niyam, third is asana, fourth is pranayam, fifth is pratihar, sixth is dharana, seventh is dhyan, and ultimately eighth is samadhi. These are the eightfold path of discipline, or the Ashtanga Yoga, that helps us to overcome and conquer our mind and also for the betterment of our body. We will discuss this eightfold yoga or the Ashtanga Yoga in our next lecture, but I hope this lecture was helpful, and to follow up, please do watch our next lecture where we will be discussing the Ashtanga Yoga in detail. So that's all for today. Thank you, viewers.